Hello, kids. Ready for Miss Osborne the Mop? Chapter 8. What did they see when they saw the cabin? Let's find out. "Oh, Dill!" exclaimed Jody reproachfully. "It's got worse since I was here last." "Lots worse," said Dill hastily. "Honest, it has." Well, it couldn't have been very good even then, Jody told herself, because it must have taken a long time for one cabin and clearing to get this ramshackle and disreputable looking. The house leaned to one side as though a good wind would blow it over, and the little porch leaned the other way as though it had quarreled with the cabin. At the dirty windows, cobwebs made a thick screen, and from the half-open door, a long trail of empty bottles, elderly shoes, rags, and newspapers slid down the sagging boards of the porch and spilled out into the sandy earth, where 3 or 4 bedraggled hands squeezed their wretched way through rusty fenders, cans, broken pots, scraggly weeds, old tires, odds and ends of lumber, and a good many other things that were not immediately identifiable. The mop just stood there looking stunned. Jody wondered if she might faint. Dill gave a low whistle. "Gosh," he said finally. Then he turned to the mop. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just didn't know it was this bad. Cross my heart, I didn't. But you got to stay. We promised Mr. Poteet, remember?" "Of course I shall stay," answered the mop. "I never had anything else in mind. I certainly wouldn't go back on my word to Mr. Poteet." She turned her head slowly, looking around. "It's just that I didn't have the faintest idea it would be like this. I had thought quaint cabin, peace and quiet." Her voice faded sadly. Her thin shoulders drooped. All at once, Jody felt terribly sorry for her. "Well, it is a lovely place," she cried, taking the mop's bony little hand in hers. "Look at the view, and those nice white flowers over there, and we could clean it up. It could be a sweet little cabin if it was tidied up, I think. Dill and I could do it, couldn't we, Dill?" The mop took a step forward. She suddenly held up her head, and a gleam came into her eye. "We certainly could clean it up," she explained. Jody had an odd sensation. Cleaning up is what mops are for, she thought, and didn't know whether her suggestion had been a good one or not. "It would be a good deed," the mop went on enthusiastically. "Of course, Mr. Poteet doesn't realize how run down his property has become. I suppose he's too short-sighted to see it, and perhaps too old and feeble to do much about it, even if he could see. Yes, I really think rehabilitating this place would be a fine neighborly thing to do." Dill looked doubtful, but he said nothing. The mop picked her way through the debris to the little porch, and the children followed to peer through the door into the dimness of the cabin. Jody caught her breath. It was even worse inside, and really amazingly dirty. There was only one room, plus a little lean-to. A big fireplace took up most of one side of the room, and a little monkey stove for cooking stood beside it. Against the opposite wall stood a vast bed, covered with a homemade shuck mattress and a grimy blanket. And that was all the furniture there was. A couple of small barrels stood around as if Mr. Poteet had used them for tables or chairs, and a rocking chair with one rocker broken off leaned disconsolately in the corner. But everywhere were bottles, baskets, boxes, pails, wheels, cans, ropes, rags, pots and pans, stacks of paper, picture frames, parts of sewing machines, wash tubs, scrub boards, jars, and millions of other things, all broken and useless, and all covered with cobwebs, soot, grease, and what looked like generous splashes of Mr. Poteet's herb tonic. "The first thing we have to do is take that bed outside," said the mop. "The first thing we have to do is eat lunch," said Dill firmly. "I'm starving." Jody was hungry too, but as they sat on the porch and ate, somehow the sandwiches and cookies and lemonade didn't taste as good as she had thought they would. We should have eaten down by the spring, she told herself. Who could have any appetite in this ugly place? And with her toe, she pushed a rusty can and 2 muddy chicken feathers outside of under the porch. Dill, however, didn't seem to mind. He kept right on eating while he poked around, finding all kinds of things that made him exclaim with delight. A coil of wire and an old automobile battery, a bag full of nuts and screws, and a bedpost with carved vines curving up it. When the lunch was all eaten, the children went back into the cabin. On a nail by poor Mr. Poteet, thought Jody suddenly. What a horrible way to live. On a nail by the door hung a worn and patched gray overcoat. Was this really all the old man's clothes except those he was wearing? By the stove, with the chicken feed, sat a tin pail full of cornmeal, a bag of squishy potatoes, and a bucket of lard. Was this what he ate day in and day out? She gave a little shiver. What's the matter? Asked Dill, coming up beside her. I was just thinking about Mr. Poteet, she exclaimed. I feel so sorry for him, living in this awful place with nothing good to eat and no clothes and everything so ugly. Gosh, I don't think that's so awful, said Dill, looking around. I think it's kind of nice, and I expect he likes it. He's got all these interesting things around right here where he wants them. He doesn't ever have to think about putting things away in boxes or closets. When he wants something, why, there it is, right where he left it. Neato. He pushed an ancient-looking leather briefcase out from under some wire screening. And when he gets ready to go someplace, he just goes. He doesn't have to worry about locking up or putting things away or packing. Good grief. When we come up here, you ought to see the packing we do. For days my mother is packing and packing and packing. We just about go crazy with all that packing. And when we go back to town, it's even worse. He wiped some cobwebs off his hand. Of course, he added, I don't guess I'd want things to be this dirty. And I wouldn't like just eating those crummy potatoes and cornbread the way Mr. Poteet does. But I think he likes them. Jody thought this over. Maybe Dill was right. But she certainly wouldn't like it living this way. Not even if she could have fried chicken and lemon pie every day. The way to do this is to sort the stuff out, Dill explained, picking up an old doormat and discovering a ladder with only 2 rungs beneath it. You know, stack up papers to be burned and the cans to throw away and all this good junk. We have to move the bed outside first, the mop interrupted. I will not spend a night in this house while it is in this condition. I will sleep under the stars. I do wish that mattress weren't so dirty. We've got a blanket to cover it with, said Jody. She wondered if they could get that bed out of the house at all. The square, dark wooden posts were massive, and they looked as if they weighed tons. And she and Dill did have a struggle getting the headboard and footboard outside, but fortunately there were no slats or springs, just a sort of rope sling crisscrossed between the sides of the bed to lay the mattress on. They set up the bed under a big sugar maple tree. I hope it doesn't rain, Jody whispered to Dill. Well, she was the one who wanted to have it outside, he answered. Besides, I don't think it's going to rain for a while. Actually, I don't know why she'd mind getting wet. Jody giggled. She's a dust mop, not a wet mop, she said. And Dill grinned. While she spread the blanket over the grubby mattress, Jody watched Dill and the mop. They both seemed quite happy to be rooting around among the boxes and jars. But she had an idea they had very different reasons for doing it. As for Jody, she was feeling truly discouraged. They could never get this place cleaned up. What had made her suggest it? And how did the summer manage to get worse and worse? Scrubbing and mopping and brushing. What a ghastly way to spend your vacation. The mop trotted through the door of the cabin and then turned to call them in after her. I think Dill is quite right, she said thoughtfully. We must organize a plan. The thing to do is get all the paper and rags and things of that order and burn them. This afternoon, quickly, while the ground is still damp from the recent rains, and then we can begin to dispose of the other things." There was a surprising quantity of burnable things. A stack of 20-year-old magazines, wads of newspapers, some rolls of wallpaper mildewed and stained, and rags, sleeves without shirts and shirts without sleeves, single socks and gloves, and thousands of greasy, dingy objects of unidentifiable origin. They formed a huge pile, and the fire made such a smoke that Dill was worried. "If the forest ranger comes along to investigate this, we'll really be in a pickle," he muttered to Jody. But the forest ranger didn't come. And though the mop kept finding more pieces of paper hidden under bushes or wedged between the boards of the house, eventually the fire burned down to ashes, to iridescent flakes of paper and wads of smoldering cloth. They dug up some of the damp, sandy soil in the clearing and spread it over the remains of the fire, and Dill stamped it down firmly. "We have to go now," Jody told the mop a little timidly. "We have to be back in time for supper. I do hope you won't be lonely tonight." "Nonsense," said the mop. "I shall go right to bed and be well rested for tomorrow's work." "Me too," said Dill. "I'm tired out." And he yawned. "We'll be up here as early in the morning as we can get here," Jody said. And when they started down the path toward home, she turned to look back at the grotesque little figure perched on the edge of Mr. Poteet's enormous bed. "Does she sleep?" wondered Jody aloud. "Or does she just lie there? And what does she think about while she's lying there?" "She thinks about mopping," said Dill briefly. But Jody didn't agree with him. A person who was a mixture of Dust Mop and Jody Ransom and the supermarket at Wolftown and Miss Osborne and the sorcerer's apprentice surely must have some very unusual things to think about as she lay under the stars. "Well, I guess we'll never know," Jody thought, and pelted on down the path. The next morning, the mop's organized plan went into effect. Mostly it seemed to mean disposing of all the useless, broken, dirty things that cluttered the cabin. Dill and the mop argued over the question of what was no good and what wasn't. "Look here," Dill would cry, holding up some filthy object. "A perfectly good plastic seat cover. Or hot water bottle. Or electric razor, or whatever it was." "Throw it away," the mop would say sharply, and Dill would protest. "It's only got a couple of teeny holes in it. We could mend it with Scotch tape." And then the mop would stamp her tiny foot and glare from under her stringy hair. And eventually Dill would shrug and say, "Oh, well," and the precious item would join the other things to be disposed of. And this brought up further argument. Dill was all for dumping these things from the house out in the yard, and Jody too thought that was the most sensible plan. The yard was close at hand, and nothing could make it look much worse. Jody supposed that secretly Dill hoped something would happen before they had to clean up the yard. She did herself. She couldn't think of what it would be, but she hoped it was something. Now the mop shook her dusty head. "There's no point in increasing the disorder," she pointed out. She had that gleam in her eye that made Dill say they would end up scrubbing the whole mountain, dusting the huckleberries and putting wax on the acorns. "Well, what will we do with this rubbish?" asked Jody. "Bury it," answered the mop. "Dill can dig up some deep holes, and we'll bury it all." "Are you out of your mind?" cried Dill indignantly. "I can't dig any deep holes around here. It's too rocky. And besides, I'd be digging holes from now till Christmas to bury all this stuff." "Don't shout," whispered the mop. "It makes me feel quite faint." She shut her eyes and pressed her hand to her skinny chest. "Then I shall do it myself, though I shall probably make myself ill." And she went and fetched an old spade out of the lean-to and began to dig, stopping every now and then to sigh and hold her head. The ground was certainly rocky and very hard. "She's not ever going to get a hole big enough to bury her toe in at that rate," Dill told Jody. Oh, Dill, you have to think of something to do with this stuff, Jody cried. We can't sit here and watch her doing that. Oh, all right, said Dill. I guess I have to. So, of course he did. He thought of the sinkhole. It was right back of Mr. Poteet's house, a rocky chasm which fell away into a black, bottomless depth, where some flaw in the mountain's rocky structure had opened a shaft far down into the earth. To get there, you had to go around behind the cabin and through the weedy clearing, and then about 50 feet along a little path that twisted between laurel bushes until you came up to the gaping hole. Jody and Dill traveled this path so many times during the next few days. Jody complained that even after she was asleep at night, her feet kept walking over it. Armload after armload of rubbish went racketing hollowly down into the earth. Dill saw a lot of it go with a pang. Oh, I should have buried it, he told Jody. Then I might have been able to dig up some of it later. Jody grinned and went back for another load. She didn't want any of these things. And actually, she was enjoying herself immensely. It was fun to take up a big basket full of broken bottles and rusty cans and odd wheels and send it echoing down into the dark. You could hear things breaking and splintering as they bounced from side to side of the shaft. The sounds grew fainter and fainter, and then stopped about the time the load hit Australia, Jody thought. Dill ran and caught up with her. We should have thrown the mop down there, he said. But Jody knew he was only teasing. As a matter of fact, both of the children were having a good time as a taskmaster. The mop had only one serious flaw. She didn't get tired. And she didn't understand what Jody and Dill meant when they said they wanted to rest. She herself worked very hard, trotting back and forth with boxes of refuse. She was very strong and could carry a heavier load than Dill even. Though her legs were so short, she couldn't, like Jody and Dill, step over weeds, bushes, and piles of debris. Instead, she had to skirt around them with her tiny steps so that the walk back and forth to the sinkhole took her much longer. Here they are. Can you see them? Okay, just 1 second. Can you see that? However, her skinny little leathery wooden arms and legs never seemed to get weary. When the children insisted on stopping for a rest, she would hold her head and say faintly, "Yes, I mustn't overdo." But no sooner had they settled down in the same shady spot than she would jump up, saying eagerly, "Now we've rested, back to work." The only thing that saved them from dying of exhaustion, Dill said, was that the mop was so easily distracted. She had sharp eyes and ears, and she saw many things that the children missed. "Look," she would call as she rounded a huckleberry bush, "a butterfly just emerging from its chrysalis." And Dill and Jody would welcome the opportunity to sit down and watch that limp, bedraggled, ugly object squeezing out of its little wizened case. It crouched in the sun and stretched until its wings flowered into brightly scaled expanses of amber and silver and copper. "Oh, how pretty!" Jody cried. "What kind is it?" asked Dill. The mop cocked her head. "That's a wash day product, if I'm not mistaken," she answered. And Dill poked Jody again. Jody and Dill soon learned to do some sharp looking of their own, since this was to be the only way they ever got a chance to catch a breath. The pleated, silky underside of a toadstool, a spider swathing its prey in a band of white silk, a snail leaving a glassy trail behind some moss, ants moving their white eggs from one hiding place to another. All these things were fun to see, besides slowing down the mop's whirlwind activities for a while. Little by little, the house was cleared of everything in it. Only the stove squatted forlornly by the gaping black fireplace when the mop and the two children returned from the last trip to the sinkhole. "Jeepers," groaned Dill, "I'm glad that's done." "Yes," agreed the mop eagerly, "because now the hard work begins." Dill rolled his eyes at Jody. "What does she call hard work?" he muttered. "Are we going to have to vacuum clean the whole mountain?" Chapter Chapter 9. See you next time.